My wife and I have recently updated the downstairs of our home, but we haven't gotten to the dining room yet. So, in this week's episode, I'm going to start working in there. We've decided to do some faux wainscoting, or sometimes it's called picture frame molding. And in this video, you might find some of the do's and definitely quite a few of the do nots. This is part one in the series, so subscribe and tune in next week if you want to see the final product. This is a stop that I threw together to go along with the miter table that I built in last week's episode of Diso Does DIY. I've got a little bit of an update video coming out where I talk a little bit more about that. Also, you can see here that I've never actually used this miter saw to cut at an angle, so it took me a minute to figure out actually how to turn this thing. There you go, buddy. Good job. The next issue that I discovered when using the miter saw at an angle was, where am I supposed to measure from to actually set my stop up? It's difficult to measure from the edge of the blade because it's at an angle now, and if I don't go from the exact start of the cutting point, then I'll be cutting somewhere in the middle of the cut and the measurement won't end up being right. Trying to judge what the exact edge point is and measure from that location, or the center of the well that is cut out for the blade to go to the edge, is basically just as difficult. I think probably a lot of miter saw tables have this back fence that is hard mounted and it may have a couple of inch marks already on it. That would really make a big difference. I think I'm going to be setting up some permanent measurements on those fence pieces so that I can easily make measurements in the future. Another difficulty that I had when measuring and using the miter saw at an angle was really the process and the order of operations. You can see here that I have a straight cut all the way at the end at the current stop point, and I'm cutting the first angle out. The idea was that if I cut off the angle on the other side, I would have the piece, the length of the piece that I want. And from end to end, I measure here, and I actually think it's ever so slightly long because I was still getting my stop set just right. But the important thing to remember or consider when you're measuring your wall to figure out all the different pieces and cuts that you're going to have to do is to make the measurement for the outside of the frame that you're going to be putting up. The thing that I'm struggling with in this shot is that the stop I'm using currently is just a clamp at the very end of the stop / fence that I've created, and for the longest cut in the entire project, it's right at the very edge. So that clamp is just barely hanging on, and then I'm going to cut this. I think I said earlier that it was too short, but I believe I actually need to be 35 inches. I can't remember exactly, but it is very close to the edge of my stop there. Now, this is the first major mistake that I made. I ended up correcting it, of course, later, but flipping the piece over, as I've done here to cut it, does not work. Don't do it. You need to cut flat. It's just a bad idea. Additionally, what may be slightly hard to tell is that I've actually cut these angles on the second piece backwards. So if you look at the one that I just picked up, the sort of larger rounded piece is where the longer of the two edges is, where on that second one that I cut, it's actually on the sort of smaller side, which I actually intend to be on the inside of my picture frames. And real quick, I'm going to interrupt myself. Even though these pieces are cut wrong, what I'm doing right here, which is just writing down the length of that piece, is a really good idea, and I highly recommend that you do it on every single one. So finally here, I've realized that I'm not going to be able to cut all these pieces without changing the direction that the saw is cutting from one 45-degree angle to the other. So I started by cutting off a little piece at the end to get my starting angle. I ran it all the way to the end of the stop, swivel the saw around, and cut the other piece. Now it's the length that I need it to be. I can set up pretty easily for the next one, and I don't have to worry about flipping pieces around or trying to measure in two different directions. The problem is I have to swivel the saw back and forth multiple times for every single piece. So if you know of a faster, smarter, more efficient way of doing this, please highlight it in the comments, because I am really curious to know. And again, you see here, I write on each of these pieces. And I also have a cut list, which is very helpful. Just make sure you actually read it, but more on that later. Now, I didn't get a lot of footage on this, but this is a pretty key element to the whole thing. I'm cutting two exactly 4" by 4" spacer blocks, and you'll see here that I set the two of them up, one in the corner of the wall and one at the bottom of the chair rail. And what that does is creates a perfect location for me to put the first piece of the picture frame in for the spacing that I want to have between all the different pieces. And once I put in that first nail, I can remove one of the spacers and use the other one as a guide to make sure the thing is level against the wall. And right here, I discover another fairly large problem. I'll let my past self explain the problem. Okay, so what happened is when I was measuring this, I was measuring roughly to make sure that I had purchased enough material. And when I was looking at this measurement from the top of the baseboard to the bottom of the chair rail, I just glanced at it and said, oh, it's 27 inches. That way I knew that I would buy enough material. But, and the vertical run here is really important because it's the same for all but two of the boxes, the frame. So it ended up repeating 26 times. So you take that measurement that's incorrect of 27 and you multiply that, well, you subtract 4 for this, for the top space, and 4 from the bottom space, and you're left with 19, which is what I cut my vertical frames to. They're pretty accurate at 19 inches. But this space is actually 26 5/8, 26 11/16, really. Yeah. So 26 11/16 minus 4 is going to be 18 11/16. So I got to go cut a little bit off of 26 of these. Cool, very cool. Luckily, I cut them longer than they need to be, so all I had to do is remove some material. And I only put 3 nails in this guy, so I should be able to remove it without damaging the walls. And I might just replace this one, but yeah.
I didn't look at either of these.
So I've just realized that even though I recut all of those pieces, I still didn't measure correctly, and they're all wrong.
So me to be your videographer?
No.
Why not? I think I would do a really good job.
Yeah.
You don't need to be in here. Come on. Come on.
So you may notice, while fully aware that all of the vertical pieces for 95% of all of the frames are currently cut to the wrong length, I have continued to move forward with the project. The reality is it's a very, very small amount, and if you look at the spacer there, one of the two has a little black pencil mark on it now, and I actually just cut an edge of that one a little bit shorter, and that will be the one that I will use to make sure that the bottom rail is lined up, and a fraction of an inch won't be noticeable in the final product. Oh my God. So even if you're okay with the measurements being slightly off, you still need to line it up straight. Once you finally get one or two done and you start to understand the process of it, it's really easy to just set up and roll right through and get quite a few of them done. You may encounter some unique scenarios. I definitely try to make sure that I get a nail in wherever there's a stud. Obviously, you have to make sure that you avoid power outlets and things of that nature, which you definitely need to plan for before you even cut your pieces. But once you get rolling, it's really not too bad of a project. When my wife and I decided we wanted to do this in the dining room, we actually were going to ask a carpenter that we know to do the work for us, but we watched some YouTube videos to learn a little bit more about it. And that was when I discovered the method of using two 4-inch by 4-inch spacer blocks to easily line up all of the pieces. I wouldn't doubt that other people do it this way. It may even be a really common trick, but I originally saw it on Finnish Carpentry TV and their YouTube channel, and I'll link to that video in the description below. It was also a real easy way to convince my wife that I needed an air compressor. And while the overall project isn't very difficult, you may still encounter some different problems. So more mistakes have been made. Minor. I got to the last panel here, and so what occurred was I did the math and measuring correctly initially. It's 135 inches. I want to have 5 panels. I subtract my 4-inch spacer from both sides, and then because I have 5 panels, there's 4 spaces in the middle. Those spaces are always going to be 4 inches, so I subtract another 16 from that. I think that ends up being 111. Divide that by 5 and you're left with 22.2 inches per top and bottom rail that go across, and then I cut those. Well, I wrote that down in my notebook, and then at some point I transferred it, whether it was when I was estimating materials or just in my head at some point. It went from 22.2 to 22.5. So I wrote it down in my notebook initially correctly, but then on the cut list I wrote 22.5. So I cut all these to 22.5. When I measure them, they're actually all slightly long. They're more like 22 3/4, not quite. They're about almost exactly 1/2 inch longer than they should have been. 22.2, they're really more like 22.7. So multiply that by 5 and you have 2.5 inches extra. So it almost touches the wall. I don't want to redo all these. I'm not going to redo all these. So my solution was I cut 2 inches off of this piece, and I'll sacrifice a 1/2 inch of the spacing on the wall in this corner over here. So in the end, I think because it's all the way down in the corner, it's kind of like the farthest one away. I'm hoping that it won't be super noticeable, but we'll see. All right. All I have left is the spot here under the window. They're going to be a little bit different. They're kind of long and they're really short. So I'm just going to figure that out. I'm slightly concerned that I'm going to end up having to move an electrical outlet, but I think I'll be good because the beam or the post there should be right in the middle of those two windows for support. Overall, not really that bad. Once you get rolling on it and you start to figure out your system, it's pretty easy. You know, the mistakes that I had were very certainly inexperience. You know, things that I'll not only did I learn for future projects of this nature, but like I think any project, you know, they say measure twice, cut once. I kind of like measured, cut, rough cut style, I guess. Totally ended up working out. I have a few little spots where I'm always probably going to be like, it's not exactly perfect, but it looks really good. I'm going to have to come through with some wood filler. Once it gets painted and I get a little bit of wood filler in there, I think it'll actually look really good. I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I think when Katie gets home, she'll be excited too. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this last little spot. Every time. Always something. Gracious. Yeah, no worries. Bye. Oh my God. Keep on doing it wrong. Eventually you'll get it right. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and call it there. As always, I appreciate everyone tuning in to watch my videos. I hope that they made you laugh or maybe you learned a little bit of something. If you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, you'll be made aware when next week's episode is available and you can see how this project finishes up. So until then, stay safe out there.